Well, my name's Maria Bouchard, and I'm a speech and language pathologist, and I own the Literacy Corner, and I've been in business for about 11 years. And I guess in 2008, I was at a speech and language pathology convention, and I heard a presentation on dyslexia. I thought, kind of sounds like one of my kids, the struggles that he had in school. But also I realized as a speech and language pathologist that many of my students that I saw in the school system had spoken language impairments. So it was more how they understood language or how they expressed themselves. But what I realized is which was having the most adverse effect on their academic performance wasn't their spoken language skills, but their written language skills, their ability to read, write, and spell. So that started my interest in researching types of interventions that would help these individuals, and that's how I came across the science of reading.
My name's Kate Farrow. I am a mom to 2 kids, and I got involved because sometimes as a mom you know something's not right. And that's really what it came down to. My youngest son is brilliant in so many ways. I mean, he could tell you about black holes in the 2nd grade and educate me on all kinds of stuff in space, and he could do math off the top of his head without even having to write anything. But I watched him he'd just struggle when it came to even reading. And the teachers kept telling me, oh, it'll come along, he's fine, he'll catch up, read to him more, give him more books at his grade level and so forth. And by God, I did all of that. I mean, they were my world, being home with them full time. I would do anything to make sure my kids were educated. But yet everything that I was doing was still not working. And then the school said, well, we're going to put him in this program called Reading Recovery. We understand he can't read very well, so we're going to help him. As a mom, I trusted the school system. I thought, I know my business, they know their business, and if they're telling me this is what he needs, then I'm going to go along with it, and thank God they're going to do this for him. But the further I went down that path, the more I realized that was not working, and I needed to do more. So I did my own research, and then it was like eyes wide open. I understood completely the difference between balanced literacy and structured literacy, and I learned really fast that the school system that he was in had no intention of giving him structured literacy, but it was what his little mind needed. So that's how I got into this, was because suddenly I went from being a trusting parent, but knowing something's not right, to suddenly eyes wide open and I have to do something.
Thank you. You brought up the difference between structured literacy and something called balanced literacy. It has a history with something called whole language, and before that, whole word. We won't get into the details right now, but Representative Bojanowski, you work in a school. Could you maybe talk to the audience about what does it look like when a school is teaching early readers based on the science of reading and versus when it's not?
All right, so I've been a teacher, this is the 13th year. And since I came to the building, there's always been a book room, and the books are always leveled. There's books, level A, level B, level C, level D. And the whole philosophy has been you need children to be reading books on their level when you work with them. Okay, so we've got the leveled readers. So balanced literacy is essentially, and it goes back to what Mandy said, a whole language program. So it starts with reading books. And then you take those books, and sometimes you kind of work on words, and every once in a while you might work on letters, but it's really reading books. And the philosophy is if you could get children to find meaning out of reading, that they would then want to become readers, and they would maybe just magically become readers. That did not happen with my own children. So would this be a good time for this? Okay. So, for example, so how many of you are educators?
Wow.
Okay. How many of you are parents of children who struggled with reading? Some. All right. So I'm gonna share. So I pulled off a classroom next door to me. Jefferson County Public Schools uses a curriculum called Jan Richardson's Next Step Forward for Guided Reading. And the whole emphasis when you're teaching reading is on guided reading. So this is book number 1 for the kindergartners, so the very beginning. It's called Busy Clarence. Now, Clarence, if you know maybe about 40 of your letters, that's sort of the catalyst to get them to this one, is not a decodable word for a beginning reader. But here we are, busy Clarence. And so it starts, I am eating, I am drinking, and then it repeats like that. So the children read, and I'm going to put it in air quotes like that, because they are not decoding. And in balanced literacy, you start kids out at the very early, I'm talking once again early reading, with children memorizing or guessing, or our curriculum actually has cues for you to have the child look at the picture. Okay, so in contrast, so this is a balanced literacy. The books are leveled. They start out with predictable texts, and there's a focus on cueing, and we're starting with the whole. We're reading before we know how to blend letters or what letters or sounds are. So I teach, in contrast, structured literacy. So we start out in my class, I'm a special ed teacher, we do phonemic awareness, so hearing the sounds in the words, even without letters. And then we teach letters. There's a series of 57 or 56 graphemes that on site, they can tell me what CH is ch. And then we learn to find those letters and decode a syllable. And then, a little bit into that, we read what's called a decodable text. Now, in contrast, this book is my first in the series I use. If you have grandchildren or children who need to learn to read, this is a flyleaf book. The digital are available online for free this year. So this is I Am Sam. Okay, so a beginning reader can decode. If they've learned that A says ah and M says they could blend that together and get am. What a difference between I Am Sam and Clarence. So structured literacy is, as opposed to starting with reading, you start with the sounds, you start with the letters, you systematically and explicitly teach to mastery the letters, the sounds, and then you build it into words, and then you add many more complicated things. It's not just phonics, but it's really from the bottom up. You teach those foundational skills to mastery, and then you have children who become readers.
Thank you.
Is that all right?
Yeah, and I think you brought up the fact that if children are not getting those foundational skills, especially if they're met with a name like Clarence, or even, there were more complicated words in there, like drinking. If that's your very first book in school, that's laughing.
Laughing.
Right. Yeah.
We can't decode laughing. So children are not being taught to decode is the issue.
And Maria, you've had a lot of experience with children coming to you who have gone through that experience of a book being put in their hands and them wanting so badly to please the adults in front of them, but not being able to do that. How has that affected the kids that you've worked with?
Well, I think for any child, when you think of, if you've had children, the first things they want to do when they go to school is to learn how to read. That is like, oh my goodness, I want to pick up this book and be able to read. So I have seen students as young as first graders who feel they aren't as smart as their peers because they're struggling with reading. They don't feel really good about themselves. They feel embarrassed. They feel a lot of shame. So regardless if the child has a diagnosis of dyslexia or they don't and they're struggling with reading and dyslexia aren't emotional issues, a disorder or impairment, but due to the extreme stress these students are under because they're failing in school, they don't feel they're as smart. And think how scary that is that we put so much value on the ability to read with our eyes that you hear. That is the determining if you're a proficient reader, you're going to have academic success. Well, teachers don't do this purposefully, but students, kids are smart and they realize there's a lot of pressure on them to achieve that goal. And how scary for that child. This is really difficult for me. I can't learn. If being able to read is going to be my success in school and I can't do this, I'm a failure. I'm not smart. But I think what's really important is that the ability to learn is not the same as the ability to read. So when a child is struggling with reading, it's the accessibility to that content that they can't make meaning from because the print is their barrier. But if it is read to them or they have audio access, they are able to learn. So I think there is a real bias, just not in education, but in our culture, that eye reading is important. I'm not saying that it's not, but there's other ways to access information when that child is learning how to read. So I used the example that if I work with a fourth grader who is reading at a second grade level, but the only books that I put in his hands to read are at a second grade level, I am denying him all that vocabulary and content that his mind can handle. So over time, if we don't learn to accommodate our students who are struggling with reading, that gap in vocabulary, because once you hit fourth grade, the majority of the vocabulary you learn is from what you read. So what I see with my students is a lot of that emotional feeling of failure and also that they can't learn. But what's important with structured literacy is that it's so much more than phonics. Mm-hmm. It is it's teaching children the rules that govern our language for reading and writing, listening and speaking as well. So it's not just phonics. It deals with,
I've had the pleasure of watching Maria tutor children, and I see Shelley is here tonight. Hi, Shelley. Her son Jensen, who I think was only 8. He's 8 now, and there was a lesson where, they weren't doing phonics, they were doing prefixes and suffixes. As in
morphology.
Morphology, if you will. And so, yes, there's a lot more to it than basic phonics. Kate, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your family's experience. I saw you nodding your head a lot as Maria was talking.
Yes. The emotional, my son, like I said, he's genius. I'm not bragging on him. I've had it tested. He tested so high in certain areas, but yet he was sitting there in classes feeling stupid that he couldn't read. This is a world of words, and reading is so essential to everything we do today, whether you choose to read the paper or get your news elsewhere. Everywhere around us is words. To not follow the science to give these kids the way to read that works, it just baffles my mind. But no, I was nodding my head because I watched my son go through that whole emotional struggle at home and fighting me about reading books, and yet the teachers were telling me, just give him more books to read, read to him, and these kind of things. And when it came down to it and I finally learned more, I kept telling him, it's not that you can't read, it's that you haven't been taught how to read in the way that your brain works. And honestly, I had to also go so far as to say, it's not just your brain, it's so many brains in this world work better when they're taught this way versus the old way. And I know it's still what's in the schools and it's what's predominantly given them the balance, but the science of reading says these approaches that they're talking about work for 80% of folks. So why aren't we following that instead of isolating kids like my son in a special ed classroom to teach him how to read that way, when really it would benefit so many more kids and we would have less of him isolated in a room to get special education. He wouldn't have to feel like the odd duck, because he's not odd. He's brilliant, but he just needs to learn how to read in a way that makes sense. It was the same way I was teaching him to read at home, honestly. I was going, what's that letter? B. What sound does that make? Buh. Start there. Now what's next? Break it down, stretch it out. I was doing all these things and had no idea that it was a very basic, not to their extent of knowledge, but
I know, because Maria would probably say it's not buh.
There's no uhs on our sound.
Buh. They know way better than me, but
No, don't put those uhs on there.
Thank you.
They go in prison, actually.
Okay. Glad I'm not with her today. But I didn't understand why they were teaching my kid to look at pictures and just memorize. It didn't make any sense to me, and it didn't make sense to his brain. And if it, at some point the words are so big you can't memorize them all.
Right.
College and high school text is not cat and dog anymore, folks. It's not orange and blue. And if you can't decode square or circle and all these other words, you're never going to succeed in high school and college, no matter how smart you are.
LaToya, I'd love to hear from you about the work that the Decode Project does, and clearly we're here because we all care, and we also want to be talking about some solutions. So how you see your work as part of the solution, and whether or not you can do it all on your own, or you need
Absolutely
some
not.
help.
Sure. So much like Maria and Kate mentioned, I heard the conversation around access. And so we prioritize students who are living or attending school in the west end of Louisville. It's intentional for us. We know that our brains are not hardwired for reading, that you have to be explicit in teaching the brain to read. We think of it as playing the piano, where there are several notes, and they sound wonderful if you know the chords. If you do not, then you're just making noise. And so that's what it feels like to a student who's beginning to learn to read, especially a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old who's struggling with this really challenging system, actually, of learning to read. The key to access is for a lot of the children and the families that we serve and provide resources to have historically been denied access to the resources, right? Getting a diagnosis and then also being able to afford treatment for it or just support around it is really expensive. And so our work is to make sure that your zip code, your race isn't a barrier for you in order to receive these resources, especially since, again, for generations, it was literally illegal for a lot of our population to be able to read. And we know what that means for the quality of life and even for the length of one's life.
Could you just go into a little bit of detail of what the Decode project does and
Sure.
how the tutors work?
So as it began, it was just myself, 2 of my colleagues from the school who created Decode Project, and we thought that we could go around to other educational facilities, youth serving organizations and schools, and support training or resource those institutions with the science of reading and structured literacy. And we were very disappointingly, but quickly denied access to doing that. So instead, we met students one-to-one. We provide structured literacy one-to-one using quality programs, research-driven programs. And we also train our literacy mentors who we brought in because we realized we can't just do this by ourselves. They're college-age students, so they're more fun than I am. They don't have as much gray hair as I do. And the kids really just enjoy their time with them. Their first couple of sessions aren't about what grade are you in, or what do you want to be when you grow up, or what your homework looks like. We really want to learn a lot about what students enjoy, what they believe they can do well, and then to teach them that you can do hard things, that you are smart and that you are capable. And then after that, literacy mentors meet with students twice a week for at least 45 minutes to an hour, more than that if we can afford the time. With students, they're pre-tested, mid-tested, and post-tested so we can measure their success. And we're not looking to take an 8th grader immediately from reading at a 2nd grade level to being at an 8th grade level, because it's not really achievable for us in a matter of a semester, and I don't think that's a good goal to set for that student. Instead, we can show them this is where you were, and here are your gains that are significant that will help you get to grade level reading proficiency.
And, we've heard from LaToya, who is doing excellent work, but again, it's one-on-one. It's reaching a small group of children. Maria, the same, working one-on-one as a tutor. Kate, working one-on-one as a parent advocate to literally fight for services for her son. Representative Bojanowski, I know you were integral in passing the Read to Succeed Act, and so was the Kentucky Department of Education back there. And so there is support among folks at the state level for this not to be something that's little one-offs, for this to be a wholesale change for the way that we approach reading instruction. But I think one of the things that came up in the series that I wrote is that there are a lot of obstacles in the way. What do you foresee as being the biggest challenges to having science of reading in classrooms across Kentucky?
I think the biggest obstacle is that there is a belief that has been around for 30, 40, 50 years that children learn to read in a certain way that has been disproven with cognitive neuroscience and other research, yet that belief is embedded in curricula that now not only the publishing company doesn't want to lose its hold on its sales, but the educators believe in this methodology. And shaking that belief, I know you said one sentence, but shaking that belief and helping people, and it's not the teachers. I'm going to start there. because we in our building are told we're teaching this curriculum and you are to teach it with fidelity. The district is endorsing and actually making schools do a balanced literacy curriculum. And, you know, educators sometimes will close their door and do what needs to be done. But if we don't change how children learn in the general education classroom and then keep trying to support them with interventions afterwards, and then those interventions are on the same, I'm trying not to say pedagogy, on the same framework, mindset as the curriculum that didn't teach the children to read in the first place, which is exactly the case in Jefferson County Public Schools, we're not going to make any changes. So the most important thing of this bill passing is that we need to start making changes. Did you want me to go into the bill at this point or go kind of through
I don't
it?
think do you see anything coming up in the next legislative session that you think will address literacy at all? Or do you
Yes,
think,
I anticipate that there will be more that will address literacy. I'm not exactly privy to what it will be. I do anticipate that we'll look a little more at how higher ed is teaching teachers how to teach reading. So I went back and, you know, when you're a teacher, 13 years ago I did my master's. I had the Fontes and Pinnell guided reading book on my shelf from them. That was my book for my gen ed reading class, Guided Reading, Balanced Literacy. I opened it up and there it is. Look at the picture. I'm like, oh my goodness. And then in my special ed course, I had Louisa Moats and more of the structured literacy. But we have to start with our teacher prep programs and ensure that they know how to read. And any changes that need to be made, that might happen legislatively. I would like to see all our teachers be required to do the professional learning to teach them how to be better teachers. And if that doesn't go through, then at least make the principals do the principal version so that they understand. You know, I'm trying. I've spoken to my principal at length. He listens to me, but he gets pressure from above. And if the district is supporting a balanced literacy learning process, we're just fighting. So I know if you have any specific questions, Mickey Ray and Christy Biggerstaff back there from KDE will be able to answer them. But, you know, I do anticipate that there will be more about reading because we need to keep, just having the Senate Bill 9 pass is not going to teach how all teachers teach reading, nor how all districts select the program to use. We're going to have to keep going at it. And there's pushback. I mean, there are reading recovery teachers who are, this is the whole language process within which all of these balanced literacy curricula come. They're trained in advocacy. They go and meet. They bring the senators in and the representatives in to watch them. One senator said, these are the only people who like me. We're going to have to convince the senators that even if their constituent says, oh no, this is how we have to teach reading, that it's like, no, the research isn't there anymore. And it's going to take time. But yes, I do anticipate there will be more legislation.
I just wanted to add that often most things in our society become politicized, and the fortunate benefit for Decode Project and having a partial contract with the district is that we've been able to go into schools and to provide some programming, both one-to-one and small group, and educators have their ears to the wall. They are paying attention. They are noticing. They are asking, how are you doing that? Where did you learn that? We've had educators. We have a teacher, classroom teacher of 70 years who works at Decode Project now, who could speak to not being prepared to teach this kind of level of reading, the explicit instruction. What's fortunate for us is that the more exposure that we have inside of schools like King, like Bick, like Maupin, the more that educators themselves, even teachers who've been trained in whole literacy or whole language or balanced literacy, are starting to come around. I have a friend who referred to it as coming over to the dark side. I would say you're walking into the light. But I think that we can all fill our bags with more resources to serve more students. I don't have a PhD in any of this, and I happened upon this because I'm a problem solver. But I do think the more resources we're able to offer students, because they are different and because they do learn differently, the more success we're going to see. And our young people, of course, are our biggest investment. So it only makes sense to learn as much as you can and not be pigeonholed into the thing that maybe you researched on your own or went to school for.
And if I could follow up just briefly. So, a lot of pundits will say, oh, it's like whole language or balanced literacy versus phonics. Right. This is not what we're saying. We're saying we need to teach our children with direct instruction how to do those foundational skills. And we need to continue to expose them to vocabulary, to high interest things. So Mandy may be getting to this, but one of her things is what do we need to do to make literacy better in our state? Number one, we need to make sure our children learn those foundational skills. And number two, we need to shift to what's called knowledge-based curricula. So I'll give you an example. We are supposed to teach the standards, right? We've got state standards. They're wonderful foundational standards, wonderful standards. But in order to ensure we teach the standards, because of the high-stakes accountability testing, we've increased the amount of time we spend on reading in the classroom. So what has gotten less time? Science, social studies, all of these different areas. But then we've increased our time with reading, but we're not taking 3 weeks to dig into a unit about frogs. We're doing random passages here and there and everywhere to check to see if a child has learned a standard. So this really hit me. There's a book called The Knowledge Gap. And I was reading this book, and I went into one of my children's classrooms, one of my students, and there on the board is a whole slide about text features. We've got captions, we've got photographs, we've got headings and all of that. And my student, Sawyer, he was like really getting into the topic. And I kept having to redirect him to now which one of those is a caption? Which one of those is which text feature? So we have gotten this myopic view in teaching the standards versus teaching our children knowledge. And that's where it gets to some of our children who, in some of the literature, calls school dependent. If you have a child who most of their learning is going to happen at school, and all we're doing is drilling them on skills to find the main idea on passage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 15, we are not building their background knowledge in the building. And those two pieces, the foundational skills and building their background knowledge through what we're teaching them.
And to that point, I have been in that position where I was that teacher, where I was doing the passages and we're finding the main idea, and you wonder why at the end of the day when a child goes home to their caregiver and their caregiver asks, what'd you learn today? I probably didn't learn anything, right? Where I could have been very excited about learning about amphibians or ancient Egypt. I'm going to open it up to questions, so if anybody wanted to ask one of the panelists, you can go ahead and line up at the microphone. And Michelle, you're coming right on up, so I'm not even going to, we're going to go right for it. If you could just introduce yourself before you ask.
Yeah, Michelle Penix, community kid advocate. Kate, you were so on, and I just wonder what happens when a community of children feels stupid.
Right.
Mm-hmm. It's
right.
one thing for one child, but with an entire community.
Tons of them. And
that's what's happened to our community. That's what's happened to our kids. The second point is, in 1997, 2020 came on. I was 25 years old. I was watching television as a fourth grade teacher. They had a program that came on and said, what if there was a program who taught kids how to read and you found out that you weren't teaching it in your district? And I watched the program, and it was about direct instruction. And everybody in here who went to school in the 70s and 80s, you know what that was, because that was reading mastery, SRA, those books that you had. And so I went to the district the next day and I said, I want this. And they said, shh, this is our secret. And I started teaching it. And then I became a principal and I started teaching it. And then 3 years into my principalship, they said, no, we want balanced literacy. Why? Because teachers didn't like structured literacy. They didn't like the feeling of being told to point to those letters and words. It was really a pushback from teachers at that time saying, this isn't fun for the kids. I don't get to engage with the kids. I don't get to have relationship with the kids. And so out went structured literacy and in came balanced literacy. The other thing I will say is I fought that. We continued to teach structured literacy. And the only time our test scores as a 100% African American, 100% free and reduced lunch school raised significantly were the years when we were teaching structured literacy. And JCPS said, no, that's it. And then finally, I'll just say the same thing that I think is underlining this for me tonight, and that is we've got to continue to fight this around equity as well. 80% of my children in this community, black children in this community, cannot read. And we're not in this room tonight. We're not in this room tonight, and we've got to ask, where are the black people? Where are the black people? Is it because they have not been taught how to read and think critically in the system for the last 20 years, so they can't get into this? They didn't read the newspaper. They don't know what's happening. So that's it.
And I think that's so
It's
important
so
because
important.
it's generational at times.
Right.
So I think it's very disheartening that we're talking about this in our society, really, because it really is a crisis, because it affects us financially as a country. It affects our prisons. You know, in fourth grade, they determine how many, when they take the testing of fourth graders, they determine how many prisons are supposed to be built because of illiteracy, the scores of children in fourth grade. So I think what's so disheartening is that we as a country have to really think of this as a true crisis. And regardless if it's going to take a while to change this type of instruction, because I really feel that when educational communities do not align their instruction with the scientific research, they are creating such a disabling environment for their students. It's worse than a true disability. And what happens is they're making learning how to read so much more difficult than it needs to be. But those difficulties that those children experience have domino effects greater than any academic concerns. If we see our literacy rate in this country and what happens when you are illiterate. So that's, I just think what you mentioned about your school population is that if children are taught as a tier 1 curriculum, structured literacy, they are on the right page. And then when you see a child struggling who is getting that instruction, that could be your dyslexic child. But if I call it almost instructional dyslexia, when you aren't providing the reading instruction based on the science, that child looks dyslexic because all the same characteristics that that child is demonstrating is what a dyslexic individual struggles with reading. So I think we really, as a society, have to really determine how we're going to deal with this crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that Michelle brought up, right? We do have to be understanding of how we got here to this place, right?
But
and the reflex from how direct instruction was being used. You know, as a former teacher, I know I like to be creative. I like to be engaging. And if that's the way that structured literacy of the old days, you know, wasn't allowing for that, then we can see sort of how we got here. I do want to give a quick shout out to Jerusha in the back with the Decode project, because I watched them do incredibly engaging structured literacy lessons this summer. So it is possible to make it fun and make it engaging. It's just whether or not we are helping teachers understand how to do that.
Well,
Kate, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I want to say, I think the tide is changing, though. I mean, I really feel, I know where you're coming from, that there was huge pushback, and it was, no, we can't, and the teachers fought that fight. But, you know, running for the Board of Education recently in Oldham County, I mean, I spent a lot of time meeting with various teachers, whether it was on my front porch or at a local place over coffee, and I'm hearing, yeah, there's still some teachers that are just dug in on this reading recovery approach, but yet there are so many other teachers, kind of like what you were saying earlier, that their ears are to the door, kind of going, what are you in there doing? Because what I'm seeing is really cool and it's working, and I want this to work. Teachers are in it for the right reasons. Their hearts are in this profession, not for the money. It's for their heart. They want to do well. They want to see their students thrive. So I think the tide is starting to turn. I think the more we're introducing it and we're seeing it through like Decode Project or Literacy Corner, and teachers themselves are being forced to learn it to teach kids like mine, because now that's part of his IEP. They're talking amongst themselves and they're going, wait a minute, maybe you're onto something. And teachers that aren't even, like one of my kids' special ed teachers, when she first got trained in Orton Gillum and then was using it with my son, she said, I'm so glad I took this because I'm now doing it with my young child at home. The school isn't giving her child what he needs, but now she's trained enough to do what she can do at home. And the next teacher that got trained for my son to get it in 7th grade, she said the same thing. She said, oh my God, Miss Alford was so excited about this training, and I'm glad that I'm now getting it. So it's spreading, and people are talking about it, and they honestly just want to do the right thing. But the curriculum that's been dictated is not it. And so, you know, I want to go back just a little bit to your question earlier. What do we do? How do we change this? And, you know, I think the legislation is critical, but the legislation is there now that gives school boards the opportunity to seek out a different curriculum. And it's going to take that start of a school board and a superintendent saying, we're flipping the script. And we're doing it because the science is there saying it's time to do it. And we can no longer fail our kids in a world of words and not teach them how to read. To graduate kids at 97% in Oldham County, and yet, what, over a third, almost 45% of them can't read? How are we graduating kids that can't read?
Well, it's not that they can't read. That's what's deceiving. It's that they struggle with reading.
That's right.
So it's not that they can't pick up a book and read it. It's
And
just
read
that
something.
Right, that it's just that it's.
But we're sending them off
right.
to say you're college ready, and yet I guarantee you they're going to get there and realize they're really not. You know, not for a major education. I mean, maybe, I don't want to diminish any college education, but you see what I'm saying. We're sending these kids off into the world thinking that they're straight A students.
You're right, and I think lots of that goes to the fact that there is not really an achievement gap. There's an opportunity and an access gap, right? I think for some of the Black families that you mentioned, Michelle, it's even the way that our society is set up, we don't always consider those who have the least. This is not a shade or a knock to even the CJ, but there's a paywall to get to the article, right? There's a fee to even get to the information, and those who need it most would have to get around that in order to have access to the information. If you're a caregiver who's a struggling reader, that's a lot to try to wrestle through in order to gain the information. So we just, as a community, and this isn't just all for the professionals, but even the caregivers, we work extensively with caregivers. We will door knock for a caregiver if we can't locate you, so we can talk to you about your student. It's our job as a community, if we truly feel like our children are our biggest prized possessions and investments, to do what is required. We know that in our society, the way that we show our support or our investment is both with our dollars and with our time. And we've got to convince enough people, give them access to the information, and get everyone else to buy into it. Judith.
Thank you. So my name is Judith Bradley. Kate, like you, I'm the parent of a twice exceptional student who struggled to learn to read, and in fact was in a remedial reading group in a 3rd, 4th grade blended class. This was actually at a private school. We were told that it would likely be that his needs wouldn't be met in our home district, which happens to be JCPS. And in fact, he was turned down for therapeutic intervention. So we elected to home educate for a few years, and then I realized I'm not going to be able to teach him to read. So we enrolled him in a private school, 3rd, 4th grade blended classroom where this placement, which I questioned, for reading also translated into a placement for math. So the bottom line was he couldn't be in the advanced math class because he couldn't read the story problems, at which point I will give a shout out to Langsford, which is representatives are sitting behind me, because with 18 months of intensive 4 to 5 hours a day instruction, my son at 9-ish, 9.5, when he became a somewhat proficient reader, at age 12 got a 34 on the ACT in reading, right. Now, so that's the trajectory of a twice exceptional student, a student with disabilities, and also some gifts. Sounds much like your son.
He is twice exceptional also,
Exactly.
so I feel your pain.
So, and we ultimately did enter the school system for many other reasons, but, and my primary role now is as actually an advocate on behalf also of other families facing this.
Good
So,
for
but
you.
I do want to address that the only reason that we were able to access this was because we, in fact, my family had the resources, education, time, and knowledge to make it happen. That kills me every time I work with a family, knowing that their child's success is largely a function of their ability to advocate. That is wrong. We have to change the system.
Amen.
And one of the ways I believe we need to change the system, and now I'm going to address a question to you, Tina, is by looking for the granular data, which the data that really shows us what's going on. You talk about what you do in your special ed classroom, that is phenomenal. The data don't show, unfortunately, that the majority of our special ed kids are receiving, in fact, that kind of instruction either. And we've got a lot of overlap with our black and brown, especially boys, not to be sexist. So, you know, how do we address that? It seems to me that although we may think we can afford to wait, for that child whose future is being written as if they didn't have ability or capacity, on behalf of that little one, we can't afford to wait. So, you know, I guess as I get older, you know, approaching retirement, whatever that means, I realize that I no longer have the patience I once did in some regards. This is one of the areas. Can families who can be engaged, can community engagement, excuse me, change not only legislatively, but at the district level? How do you feel we can make our voices heard, really heard, in a way that can make a difference?
To get away from the shall or the must or the can language that's in all these I'm just saying, there's so many legislation that we put in place, and it's optional for the districts to make change instead of it, you know, it's time to make the change. I'm asking the same question, so.
So, you know, I advocate every day, and I have met with the superintendent. I'm making my rounds through meeting with the school board members. I meet with my principal pretty regularly, you know, and it's educate. But then at a certain point, you know, things happen like Mandy's, this is shaking things up. You know, something's going to have to get them to say, something is going to have to shake them away from this balanced literacy focus.
Right.
And we as parents, I as a parent, you as a parent, me as an educator and a legislator, you just have to keep writing the letters. When you're talking to your legislator or your school board members, a personalized letter as opposed to clicking a form is always better. But, you know, share how important, share your pathway with the school board. And I'm working the school board right now to try to help them understand, because there are decisions, and there was a new person hired in the literacy level in JCPS who is a reading recovery teacher. And to me, that's very problematic, because they're going to have a myopic view of how reading should be taught. And I mean, I'm as progressive as you get as a Democrat. I think that children shouldn't just sit around and try to read and learn to read. I think it needs direct instruction. And I'm not at all progressive about that. I think we need the direct instruction. But how are we going to shake those decisions? Right now we're talking superintendent who listens to his key staff. How do we impact those key staff? Because in Jefferson County, so graciously, the General Assembly passed Senate Bill 9, and with that came money, which usually doesn't happen. The General Assembly appropriated $22 million, and KDE is pitching in $10 million from their ESSER funds. Do I have it right, Mickey? $10 million. $32 million over the next 2 years that can be appropriated for professional learning for educators. Do you know how many JCPS teachers signed up for that training? Fewer than 200.
And how many of them are special ed teachers?
No, it's a mix. Not very many. I mean, you know, I don't know, but I would assume that it's a mix. But the problem is because the district believes in balanced literacy, they didn't even send it out. I never got an email about it. So that's where it has to change. It has to go back to the superintendent and his key staff and the people who are hired into those positions, and that's where the change has to happen. And at this point, the school board who hires the superintendent, as opposed to the change in the other law where SBDMs do not any longer pick curricula.
Right.
It's the superintendent. So that's where we have to
So
aim.
it's leadership, right? And leadership has to have vision, and I think that it's our responsibility to make clear the vision that we want for each and every child.
Right.
The public education system needs to serve the whole public. I mean, and it's not a political issue. It
Thank
should
you,
just
by the
be, you're welcome. It should just be, I mean, reading is success for life, period. And if our community is successful as a whole, then we're going to be, I mean, I don't know why it's even a political issue, which is so sad to me, because when I ran for the Board of Education, they thought I was, you know, the Democrat liberal trying to come in and take over and do some crazy stuff. And my whole platform started with, we just need to teach our kids to read. How is that left or right? I mean, that's a simple fundamental.
So there's an author, his name is Mark Seidenberg, and he kind of sums it up in his book. We are so divided as a nation, whatever the topic may be. So divided. You're right or you're left, you're whatever it may be. And no amount of trying to convince these other people changes their mind. They just dig down deeper into their belief system. So that's how it's happened with reading. We've got our balanced literacy people, we've got our structured literacy people, and despite evidence that structured literacy is how children need to learn to read, they dig in deeper. The publisher of the curriculum we use, she did a whole paper about how Jan Richardson is structured literacy. And I'm like, that's bunk. But it fed to her base, and no changes happened. So, I mean, we need to be less divided, and we need to listen to each other.
I think the issue, too, is there's a disconnect between education and science.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have all this scientific research, but education is deciding that that's not what we need to do to teach children how to read. And so it's very interesting because in any other kind of discipline, like even a physician, they don't say, well, I'm not going to listen to that research because I believe this is going to help you with your cholesterol. You know, you follow what the research says, but there is such a disconnect between education and science that I really feel that is what's causing the drift, not necessarily left and right, but because they're not willing to accept that research, which is fact, that, you know, you have to teach reading explicitly, you have to create those neural connections in your brain, and if you don't teach that way to make those connections happen, that child is going to struggle, and that's just the research. But I do think it's because for a long time we can't, science and education, and where are neuroscience scientists or linguists talking to Congress? Where are they? And so that's what's hard too, is that I think they have tried to do that research, has tried to present this to state congresses and, you know, politicians, but there's such a disconnect, and it is a belief system, I agree with you, that is hard to break. I mean, I was a speech and language pathologist in Michigan and had a classroom of severely speech and language impaired children, and I was their teacher. It was the early 1980s, mid-1980s, what do you think I was teaching? Whole language. I cringe now, but as a professional, you have to reevaluate your belief system and base it on the facts of science. Because if you don't, you're doing such a disservice to the individuals that you're working with.
Well,
and they pay the price. When there's a war, there's people that pay the price, and our children are paying the price for these reading wars. It's not the teachers paying the price, it's the children and family members who have to experience that with their child. It breaks their heart, they don't know what to do. So our children are the ones that are paying the price.
We are running very short on time, so we're going to do one more question, unfortunately. So Kathy, I'm going to let you go ahead.
All right. Hi, my name is Kathy Stovall. I actually wrote it down so I wouldn't forget and I would move quickly. One thing, this is for the Courier Journal. Newspapers in the schools. I grew up with newspapers in the school. Yeah, I'm old, but I grew up with newspapers in the school. I have tried really hard when I was working at JCPS, get newspapers in the schools. Kids need to see that. I always taught in family literacy. My dad had a newspaper delivered to rural Arkansas, and if they didn't show up with our paper, oh my God, he would call them. They had to drive 20 miles to bring our paper to us, but he said, I paid for it. And that's what I watched. I watched him, who had an 8th grade education. But that newspaper was important in our home, just like books were important in our home. Then the other thing is, across the state, I wanted to know, what are our teacher programs doing? I would like to hear from them. I would have loved to have them be here because they have control over what it's going to look like, what they're going to teach in the schools. So what are they doing? They can do more in terms of teacher preparation because I'm old and I went through this and I know exactly what it was to have SRA. I was so excited and how I learned how to read and phonics, and my children had phonics. Great readers, successful people because somebody took the time to teach them how to read.
Yeah. I think I'm certainly interested in talking more with Representative Bojanowski about what possible legislation might be coming out related to teacher preparation programs, and I think it's actually an excellent idea that maybe we convene a second panel that is focused specifically on that topic, so I appreciate you bringing that up. And I will say to one other sort of solution-oriented thing when we talk about the incredible training that KD is offering right now to teachers. It is essentially taking a master's level course. It is 2 years. It is extremely intensive. And so to be a teacher with all of their current responsibilities, adding that to their plate could be quite daunting. One thing that we have seen success, and I believe some districts in Kentucky have done it, but also in other states, is school boards coming together and deciding to offer those teachers stipends for that extra time. So just another thing to note for you constituents out there. And I'm gonna let LaToya, you have the final word.
Thank you. So our solution is not necessarily as political or policy driven, but our literacy mentors are college-age students who we pay because we know that a way to incentivize folks is to pay them for their time. And our secret, which is not going to be a secret anymore, is that they are going to become future educators that will have this resource when they go to the classroom.
I love it.
Excellent. And thank you for staying. I'm going to ask you if you just stay for a couple more minutes because I'm going to invite the new president and CEO of the Louisville Urban League, Kishkami Price, up here. And she's just going to take a moment to talk a little bit about the league's work on this topic.
Thank you, Mandy. Just really want to talk about how heartbreaking this conversation has been, just taking in this data on a regular basis. I will say in 2019, I remember us sounding the alarm about 70% of our kids, Black and brown students, not being able to read. And now we're at 80%. And I would like to thank the Decode Project, Michelle Penix, and other folks that really stepped up during the pandemic to work with students one-on-one because the numbers could be even worse. So I will say that we need many strategies in place, and I've heard a lot of that from our panelists, and we can't be in a place where we're putting the pressure on parents to be able to make these really difficult decisions that need to happen. So what I mean by that is the very barriers that LaToya was just talking about and access to that knowledge. This is a ripple effect. So we're not just talking about our kids not being able to read. The parents are also recipients of some of this same curricula, right? So they are in that same predicament. When we talk about persisting in college, a lot of our kids, as mentioned, are college ready, but they're struggling with reading. What's one of the #1 things you have to do in order to succeed in college? You need to be able to read at a college level. And so the more that we talk about how vast this issue is, the more we realize we need multiple strategies in order to be successful. So I would like to highlight that under our previous president and CEO's leadership, we were able to establish a relationship with Kumon to be able to provide some intensive tutoring. Kumon is not the answer for every child. Some children will benefit from this. We have some funding to support it thanks to JCPS, and we would like to get more students connected to that. So we do have our education director in the back, Mr. Ramsey Sabri, waving his hand back there. If you have any children that you would like to sign up for that programming, it is a tremendous value. And we've already heard so many testimonials about parents who have children that were reading 2 and 3 grade levels below where they should have been, that in 3 and 4 months are at reading level for their grade. So we want you to definitely take advantage of that. And then we also have a relationship with Equitas to do some ACT prep for students and to really prepare them in ways that they usually do not have that preparation, and parents aren't able to pay for those services. We're able to provide those services for free. So if you're interested in those resources, please contact us. If you're streaming, please reach out to us, lul.org, to get information to connect for those programs. So thank you so much for the time.
Thank you all for staying a little bit over our planned time today. I do want to just point out, if you did not get one of our special section reprints when you walked in, there are plenty by the door, and this is something that, to be quite frank, our editor Mary had to fight for us to be able to do. We work for a company that likes to keep its purse strings a little bit tight, and this was one way that, working within our system, we could try to get this information out to more people. So I think it'd be okay if you have some friends or neighbors, or maybe a community center or your church, if you wanted to grab a couple more copies to be able to share. We would love, absolutely love for you to do that. And thank you so much for being here tonight, and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you. Thank you.